Okay. I call to order the February 2026 meeting of the Governance and Policy Committee of the University of Minnesota Board of Regents. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to those joining us in the campus view room. While today's meeting is not being live streamed, the recording will be uploaded and archived to the board's YouTube channel after today's meeting. Our only item of business today is to continue our discussion of the board's appointment authority related to Division I head coaches and potential options for adjusting those thresholds. Presenting this item, our Associate Secretary Jason Langworthy and Committee and Policy Coordinator Maggie Marcassani. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chair Verhalen, members of the committee. Good morning. So this continues the conversation that you started in December. And we'll first remind you of the current threshold, summarize for you that conversation, checking based on what we think the direction the committee wanted to go. And then based on that, we'll provide some considerations as we think about next steps towards codifying amendments to the policy so that we have the input necessary to hopefully bring back marked up language at your next meeting. And so with your permission, Chair Verhalen, I'll turn it over to Committee and Policy Coordinator Marcassani.
Please, Ms. Marcassani.
Good morning, Chair Verhalen and members of the committee. As a reminder, your current policy adopted in March of 2024 reserves authority to the board for employment contracts by naming specific positions. And for athletics, that includes the Division I Director of Intercollegiate Athletics, plus the Division I head coaches for football, men's and women's basketball, men's and women's hockey, and volleyball. And as noted in the docket, these head coaching positions, with the exception of women's hockey, were positions that had previously triggered the dollar threshold. The other provision serves as catch-all language to encourage the president to bring items forward that are delegated if they raise an unusual question of public interest or public policy or have a significant impact on the university's mission. Now, excuse me. Now, you may recall from our December conversation that we presented 4 options for potential amendments to the board's appointment authority. And those included a pre-approval option, moving back to a dollar threshold, removing the approval requirement for the head coaching positions that are currently in policy, or maintaining the current list of head coaching positions. From that conversation, it seemed that the pre-approval option resonated the most with the committee. And this option would have the board define terms for appointments and employment agreements for those head coaching positions that the president could execute without board approval, as long as the agreement stays within those parameters that are set by the board. If an agreement were to exceed those parameters, then board approval would be required. I'll note that 2 of our Big Ten peers, UCLA and Wisconsin, use a pre-approval framework, with Indiana and Maryland having reporting requirements that are based on a specific threshold, either set annually by the board or in comparison to another position, such as the president. Now, Associate Secretary Langworthy will talk you through some pre-approval considerations.
So Chair Verhalen, members of the committee, when we think about then if you wanted to move forward with a pre-approval sort of system for considering these coaching contracts, there are some considerations that we need to take in place, and we're hoping that you'll give us some feedback on, because this will help us then to draft potential amendments. So first is creating a threshold, right, that's very clear, of contracts that are below that threshold are delegated to the president for approval, and contracts above would still have to come to the board. Now, complicating this is the fact that athletic employment agreements are often a little bit more complicated than other senior leader agreements, and contracts look different depending on the coach. Some coaches, the base salary will be where the majority of compensation is. For other coaches, that might be in supplemental or incentive compensation. And then if you're looking at, say, the total value of the contract, are you including what is paid annually, or are you also including some of those incentive provisions that kick in, say, if we win a national championship? So how are you figuring that out? How are you calculating that? And then certainly the other thing that you could turn to instead is market position. Where is the contract sort of compared to the rest of the market, for the Twin Cities campus and the Big Ten? And would you want to set maybe a threshold depending on where that contract is in the market compared to current peers? Some of the other considerations, if we can have the, are the setting a pre-approval terms annually. So how do we codify and create this, and sort of bring this into policy? So one option that we've seen some peers do is to set that pre-approval term annually. So perhaps finance and operations every June has a consent item that sets what that threshold is so that it can be adjusted and be dynamic based on the previous year's contracts that have been approved or where the market is. You could also just set a fixed pre-approval term in policy. That would be more static. Maybe you put in some sort of inflator within that. And then two other items to think about. Would you want to address initial employment agreements versus amendments differently? So yesterday, for example, you had two coaches that had contract amendments that were approved in finance and operations. Would you want a different threshold for amendments versus an initial agreement? And then finally, in terms of reporting requirements for those that are delegated to the president, would you want some sort of after the fact reporting, either at the next meeting following when the contract was approved? Would you want an annual report of all of the contracts that have been approved below the threshold? What would be helpful for you in terms of understanding what is going on and having that oversight of the threshold? And so here's the key policy questions we're hoping that we can tackle today. And Chair Verheugen, when we have your input, we can also then talk about some next steps after that. But we thought we would just open it up for these questions, and we can start wherever committee members would like to.
Yeah, so just so we're all clear and working from the same song sheet, when we talk about the Division I head coaches for these sports, they are all on the Twin Cities campus only, except for men's and women's hockey. So just conceptually, that's the sphere that we're looking at.
And the Duluth athletic director.
Yeah, he was on yesterday on the consent agenda.
So Chair Verheugen, Regent Bergstrom, at the athletic director, we would separate out because the athletic director traditionally has been one of those senior leader positions along with vice presidents that the board has always approved. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that clarification. So as we think about these things, I'll offer a few initial thoughts and then we can go from there and see what others' thoughts are. Thinking about our role, especially as a governance policy committee, the need for continued oversight is important. But it also shouldn't prevent the university from being able to conduct its business. And if we can establish a set of parameters for purposes of guidance, I look at it more as guidance to the president and the athletic directors than necessarily pre-approval. It's really here's the box that you're working within, and come up with a way where we look both at annually, how do we adjust those guidelines, whether it's at the end of each season, within, by the next board meeting, whatever we word it as, we get an update to finance and finance committee of finance and operations of, here's where the market is now for this sport or these roles. Or if it is every June, we get the full run of here's the summary of everything from this year. So for next year, it's all set. The summer is a nice time. It's usually quieter when it comes to changes in coaching. And then I think about amendments much the same way as we did when we were reevaluating all of our board policies on what thresholds come to us. We identified in that process that we set the baseline, but then if there were changes to projects, there was no mechanism by which those projects had to come back. And so setting that number in there of, is it 10%? Is it, for purposes of amendments, is it 10% or more than, 10% of the value or more than 20% of the initial time frame, or those kinds of things just were some of the items that popped front of mind for me. So I'm really interested to hear from the other committee members.
I can start, but I think I'm thinking similarly to you, Chair Verhalen. I think that the positions that were listed are still the right positions from my understanding of the things that we consider. I'd probably go to the market position because it's dynamic now. Now we know that, it's like, okay, what evaluation surveys are you using for market data to get that? So that would have to be some kind of standard look that we were getting with others. But I think that those parameters would make sense. And again, we're trying to avoid actually somebody coming in and having a press conference and then the board having not acted, it really can't act and say no. I mean, that's kind of the issue we're doing. So I like that, and I like the annual setting, of that, and just to look at that policy. I agree with you on the amendments. I think that can be lighter, and maybe that's related to market too, if it falls.
Still falls within the threshold.
Right, if it still falls within the threshold, that doesn't apply. So, and I wonder, and of course I want to know what others think and what President Cunningham thinks about that. But the goal is to make this simpler and more streamlined for some of these things that have to be to get the person that is desired for the position.
President Cunningham?
Yeah, I think just to share, Chair Verhalen and board, where, the way that VP Goldman and I are thinking about these things as they come in is, and where it would be helpful for the board to be thinking about where we want to be is, sort of within, for example, in our Twin Cities D1 coaches, it's really about our Big Ten peers then. So where are we aiming to be in the compensation compared to our Big Ten peers? Now, it's my job, along with VP Golden, to make sure that we can afford that range. But the questions for the board coming forward in the next couple of years, which would be helpful to have predefined thoughts about, are we aiming to be, 10 of 18, within 10 to 12 range of the 18 in the Big Ten? Are we aiming to be 16 to 18 within the Big Ten? Are we aiming for compensation that would get us in the 5 to 10 range, right? So I think what would be really helpful, and I think we're going to have ongoing conversations about, and obviously if we can't afford it, we would drop below, but to know, what's the range we're hoping for our competitiveness. And if that's, 10 to 12, then that's helpful for me to say, and then I could bring you the exception if I say we have somebody this would be putting us in the 8th or 7th position, for example. But because that's really what we're talking about here, the dollars in some ways, when in my look, are not as helpful as where are we trying to be in the market. You have a coach that's on the market. If we want to have a team that's in the middle of the pack, then I'm going to have to pay somebody, a coach, that's going to be competitive at a team that's middle of the pack, and that's going to cost whatever it costs in the market of coaches to be 10th of 18th. For our hockey program, are we aiming to be in the top 5 of what we're paying people? Because that's our expectation for us. So I think these are the conversations that I'm having with the athletic director. And then obviously, VP Goldman and I are trying to figure out how and if we can afford what our aspirations are, especially in a changing time, particularly in football.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things when we're continuing these conversations is how quickly some of those numbers change. I mean, we've seen ourselves even with presidential decisions where, yep, we're making this decision, they're in the middle of the pack, and within a month, now they're back down in the bottom 25%.
Right.
And so things do move quickly at times when it comes to those bands.
Yeah, we have to figure out, I'm in favor of some sort of threshold parameters that we can give President Cunningham, Director Coyle, freedom so that we don't have that situation arise to which Regent Wheeler referred. I am open to being a little more flexible in terms of what those parameters might be, simply because we hire President Cunningham, and I think in this instance, let her do the job along with Director Coyle. The market dynamics, especially in football, but really in basketball, all these sports, is kind of bananas. And the problem with benchmarking to, say, a percentile, in my mind, there's studies done on this in the private sector that certain Fortune 100, whatever companies often would have compensation policies that required in the contracts that their CEO be in a certain percentile. And what that does is that mathematically just leads to everybody's salaries going up. If everybody has to be in the 25th percentile, 25th percentile gets much more expensive. Now, we're only one actor, but I would just rather trust that we have great leadership in place, and maybe there's an upper threshold, right, that we need to be consulted on, but then to let them do the job of hiring the best coach they can for that moment. Right? If you look at basketball in particular, a few years ago, they hired a coach with less experience. I'm guessing he was in the bottom 5 salary-wise amongst probably Power 5 conferences. And then they hired a person away from Colorado State, much more expensive. In both those circumstances, Director Coyle had his reasonings. And I trust that he knows much more about that than I do, even though I do hiring for a living. So I lean more that way in terms of giving more flexibility. And perhaps we find an upper threshold or a within reason kind of point. But I hesitate to mark it to a percentile or something like that.
You know, one thought might be, do we set it as something like, as long as it's 75% or below of whatever our pre-established market is, and then when you're looking at these, I'm going to call them fringes, but that's not the right term, and I'm sure.
Total comp.
Thank you. So when you're looking at things like a bonus when we win a national championship, not if.
When?
You know, if it's more than X percent of a deviation from the prior agreement, like from the prior coach's negotiated agreement, something like that, where you're making some of those changes. You know, it's not necessarily an amendment, but you do have a baseline that you're starting with that this board has seen and could raise questions about as, okay, we're paying $100,000 for winning 8 games out of a season. All right, that coach leaves, we hire another one. Now they've negotiated terms that are to pay $120,000. Okay, you know, if that's within 20%, and that's a threshold we set, then those seem like reasonable to me. Not saying 20% is the number, I'm just using round numbers, but those seem like reasonable things to give our president and athletic director Coyle and Vice President Goldman the authority to consider as they're negotiating those terms with an incoming coach or renegotiating terms with a renewing coach. Yeah, President Cunningham.
Chair Verhalen, so 2 extra thoughts. One is if the board wants to consider Olympic sports separate than revenue generating sports. Because some of those thresholds might be easier to come along with. So I just toss that out there. You may not want to. And then the other component is if we do it by dollar value, I can't tell you how fast these are changing.
Mm-hmm.
For example, it's difficult for me to predict a next football coach, whenever that is, compared to current salary here in dollar numbers. So I just, as opposed to in market kind of component. So I just want to toss that out. The market's changing very quickly. Some of those sports.
Yeah, and yes.
Oh,
please.
Chair Verhalen,
Associate Secretary Langworthy, and then.
and just to build off what the president's saying, the threshold that the board established in 2018 around $1 million had that exact issue, both in terms of figuring out what was included in that $1 million, what the contract provisions were, and then the fact that it was quickly, outpaced. And so that's why then in 2024, right? The board then went to the specific positions instead and eliminated that dollar threshold because that often caused confusion. And we had a couple of agreements where there was different calculations done that then weren't flagged to the board when they should have been.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Verhalen. And just to be clear, Regent Bergstrom, I was saying that we should do it by market. We should do it as a cap. So it provides guardrails, but the flexibility for the athletic director and the president to decide where within those guardrails it sits. That said, it might have to be that the market data is different. It has to be the relevant market data for that particular sport. For example, the Big Ten works for football, but it might not work for hockey. So it just has to be relevant to that, but that would be a determination by, those in the know about what should be relevant. But I like, thinking about something like the 75th percentile. Anything above that has to actually come to the board before it's announced. Yeah, or something like that.
I think what I'm hearing of concern from President Cunningham is what we said as the market numbers in June may not be the market numbers by.
But if you set it at a percentile, then that can shift with the
Like a
market.
Are you saying a percentile of sort of, let's just pick a sport, let's say, I don't know, let's say it's hockey and it is Big Ten, just for examples. So then in the 75th of the Big Ten, which would put us, at anything, you'd be comfortable in if we paid anywhere from the 5th market salary down to the 18th market salary.
Yeah.
Right?
And then it's dynamic because 75th will change.
That's going to be moving over time, but by the market of what's out there.
Yeah, and, when I was thinking of a June approval, it would be looking back, okay, what did we have this year? Does everything look right? Does it feel right? Where are the markets now? But then understanding that the market will change, major changes likely won't happen again until the next year, but there will be shifts in what those bands are.
But if we set it at a percentage of the market, that will shift as the market shifts. So
long as we know what we're defining.
Right.
Chair Hill, we could bring you, I wouldn't want to commit without talking to Director Coyle, but I think we could bring you, let's say, I don't know, in the summer at the end of the season. Like, I think right now we know, for example, where the market is for next year for football coaches. So we could bring you and say, this is the market range for football coaches. This is, and then the board could set the market ranges that they're comfortable, not for the dollar, but, where we want to be, if that's 75th or whatever, and you could have an understanding of what the dollars for that mean, but set it by the percentile. But you would still have eyes open that 75th percentile for this means this range to that range. Yeah.
Yeah, Regent Bergstrom.
Thank you, Chair Verhalen. I also, within the sports we're talking about, there is a much smaller variance in especially women's hockey and men's hockey, though it's a slightly larger variance than there is in football, right? In football, that top quartile is very different than 75th percentile. In men's hockey, we're pretty close. The delta between our coach, I don't know the difference between Duluth and Twin Cities, but the delta between them and the highest paid coaches is not really that great. So bringing this up because I don't think 75th percentile is necessarily appropriate in hockey based
You
on.
might have to set it by sport.
Right.
And my question for us to think about between now and our next meeting is the message we send to other coaches by saying, in hockey, we're okay with being top quartile, but maybe not in volleyball, right? So we have to massage that, keep that in mind as we think about that as we set it. I understand why we would set it that way, but I just want us to think about, just connect with the director about.
I think the athletic director, if I may, Chair Verhalen, has a good sense of where their expectation is by the sports here at the University of Minnesota and which sports they have an expectation we're the most competitive in.
Right.
So, I would leave that. And if you give a wide enough range there, then that leaves the up and down.
Yeah, if we don't set the floor,
Yeah.
we set the maximum. I guess I'm a little hesitant to set it by sport because at the same time, we have selected our president. we have selected our athletic director, we have selected our vice president of finance to have these conversations and make these decisions. And when it comes down to it, whatever number they pick, they have to find a way to balance that budget around it.
100%.
And so there's that internal check and balance before, the paper even gets signed. And I worry setting it by sport, like you said, may inadvertently send a message we're not intending to send.
The other thing that was just pointed out to me, Chair Verhalen, is, of course, if the athletic director wanted to argue heavily with me that in this particular time and for a particular coach, they wanted to do something that was out of that range, it just means it would come to the board. It doesn't mean we wouldn't do it.
Right.
It just means these are the general parameters of the board.
Means you'll have to ask for a special meeting and negotiate it with them as understanding
Right.
you have to wait for our board approval.
I'm sure that happened when they made the switch in women's volleyball to kind of go big or go home. I'm guessing, I don't know if it reached the threshold of getting to the board, but it was a big delta when they hired McCutcheon. And there was a long runway on it because he wasn't going to start for a year, but that sort of thing might be something we want to give athletic director Coyle flexibility to do.
It's the question is just what comes to when the other things wouldn't have to come to the board. But if we were going to do something extraordinary because the university wanted to make a big play at a particular thing with a big coach, then that would just come to the board.
They want to get Suni Lee as the gymnastics coach, for example.
Putting things out in the universe now.
I leave it to athletic director Coyle.
Other thoughts on these questions? Should different thresholds be applied for an initial contract versus amendments? As we think about it, I kind of think of two different ways to approach it. One is just as long as it stays within the market, then we're within the market. The other is if it's an amendment, do we set a change, like a change order threshold for purposes of bringing an amendment to us? That way there is kind of that backstop check as well if something's just totally moving things around. And then is it the full dollar amount or is it by category of total comp? Yeah.
Something certainly that we should be talking about. I think I'm a little less worried about amendments only because by definition, they are about retaining, how are we retaining this coach? And there should be more flexibility in terms of time. Like for instance, yesterday's contract approvals, could have been done in theory at our special meeting in January, but there's more flexibility as opposed to when they're hiring a coach and it's got to be real quick. But we should set some sort of parameters to them. But my sense is with amendments, there's less of a time crunch. Maybe that's not always the case.
I'm going to push back on that a little bit because while with an amendment, there may not be a time crunch, there may actually be because that amendment might be to keep that coach here versus taking another position somewhere else.
Yeah.
And especially if they're working with a university where they don't have to do everything in an open meeting. It's a very different negotiating position. Yeah, Regent Wheeler.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Verhalen. I would just, I think we can keep it pretty simple. I think you can keep it within the guardrails at the top end, and I do the same thing for amendments. So I'd probably say if the amendment's within the market range, then that does not have to be approved. And just whatever percent, and I'd leave it at the same for every sport because every sport has its own market range, So I think I'd try to keep it pretty simple and keep it well understood by the athletic director and the president, what parameters they have to operate within, for both that and for amendments as well.
And when I hear think market, I think it's even beyond just the dollar amounts. It's, okay, is it market to be a 5-year contract? Is it market to be a 10-year contract? Is it somewhere within 5 to 10 years? I think that's important to know too. Because when you do sign these agreements, you're committing to a certain time frame where there usually is a buyout provision if there's a change made before that. And so it's good to know what our expectations are when President and Athletic Director Foyle are having these conversations with potential coaches. Yeah, Regent Bergstrom.
Thank you, Chair Verhalen. Related to buyouts, I don't know if it needs to be in the policy, but we may want to consider, currently we use mitigation clauses with our buyouts. There could be a day when somebody we want to hire demands that that's not in there. And I think we should consider whether we give approval for that, because that's a whole nother ballgame.
I think that, yeah, I see that as something that would have to come.
Yes, we should keep that top of mind as well.
That's a very good point.
It changes the ballgame with especially the football contracts.
As far as reporting requirements, if it's within the bandwidths, I would see it as something that's reported to us upon signing, as a board. And then included in our next board packet as an information item. We've seen it, but as an information item, here it is. That way it's easy for people to find if they want to go find them of, okay, where do I go to look for this? Okay, now I know it's going to be in every information item packet for finance and operations, for example. That's at least what I was thinking for purposes of reporting. And then obviously if it was outside of the parameters, it would need to be brought to the board for approval. And that gives negotiating leverage to the negotiators as well of, you want to go above this number, you're going to have to be in approval limbo until we can call a board meeting.
Right.
Any other thoughts? I know we're at time.
So Chair Verhalen, this was a really helpful conversation in terms of next steps. We'll work with the Office of the President, the Office of the General Counsel, probably phone in EVP Goldberg and Goldman and Vice President Horstman to help with figuring out what the specific threshold would be, and wanting to make sure, as we've discussed, it is really able to be easily replicated and understood. Then we'll start to create language within the marked up policy, and we'll bring those back to you at the April meeting for review.
Great. Any last thoughts, Regent Bergstrom?
Thank you, Chair Verhalen. Does it make sense at that April meeting, so that'd be the April committee meeting, as I understand it? I want to make sure that we are not in any way hindering our athletics department. Does it make sense if they're available to have the director and or his designee, whoever probably a main contracts person, or just along with Executive Vice President Goldman, to just kind of make sure, I want to make sure that we're not missing anything, and they're the experts, just to kind of make sure it might make sense just to gather their opinions, right? It's our decision, but I just want to make sure we're not overstepping is the wrong word, but just that we're not hamstringing them at all.
Yeah, Chair Verhalen, Regent Bergstrom, absolutely. I mean, we want to work with everyone, and also, checking in with the Duluth campus as well. This will be a big team effort to make sure that that we don't miss anything, and also thinking about market and all of the pieces that you discussed today. So absolutely, and we can also see if they're able to be on hand, ready to answer questions in April.
Good. Thank you, everyone, for the discussion. If you think of anything else, please share those thoughts with Associate Secretary Langworthy and Committee and Policy Coordinator Marcassani. Look forward to April. There being no additional business before the committee, we stand adjourned, and the board will convene in the boardroom at 9 o'clock.